You are living inside a movie set erected just 200 years ago. Ancient Greece is not the cradle of civilization. It is the most successful startup of the 19th century. We have grown accustomed to speaking the words antiquity and Hellenism with bated breath, but the historical reality is far more prosaic. The entire world operates using terms that only received official status after 1829. Until that moment, no Greece existed on political maps. The very name has Latin roots and was imposed on the region from the outside. European intellectuals, longing for a golden age, simply picked a convenient territory in the Balkans and designated it the birthplace of gods and philosophers. While the local population went about their lives, atlases for this fictional country were already being drawn in the offices of London and Paris. Who exactly held the blueprints for this global deception, and how did an ordinary English romantic poet manage to replace the work of entire historical institutions? The imported identity. The word Greece is an imported product. Local residents didn't even know what they were being called in London offices until they were presented with new passports. We juggle the terms ancient Greece and ancient Greeks so easily that we forget a basic truth. These terms are of purely Latin origin and only entered wide circulation in the early 1800s. This is a classic example of an exonym, an external name, completely replacing internal essence. While European romantics, who had never crossed the threshold of these lands, dreamed of the land of the Hellenes, the people in the Balkans had no clue they were part of some great antique heritage. To them, these lands were just home, not an open-air museum. History wasn't restored, it was literally imported in the suitcases of Western intellectuals, forcing the world to believe in a linguistic phantom. But mass psychosis doesn't emerge from a vacuum. The myth began to spread with the speed of an epidemic when the heavy artillery of great literature stepped in. Who was the man whose prose replaced real facts for millions? Byron, the architect of the phantom. A single poem replaced thousands of years of authentic chronicle. An English lord literally wrote Greece into the consciousness of the common man, turning his fantasies into indisputable facts. The legends of ancient Greeks began to multiply like mushrooms after a rain, not because of archaeological finds, but thanks to the pen of Lord Byron. In 1809, the Romantic poet visited these lands and, upon his return, poured his impressions into the first cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. The success was deafening. 12 editions in 9 years, translated into every European language. Byron created an image so alluring and romanticized that educated Europe was blinded. Writers who had never seen the Balkans began to shamelessly copy his descriptions, elevating mythical Greece to the status of a sanctuary. Reality was sacrificed for the sake of beautiful verse, and no one wanted to notice that Byron's Greece existed only on paper. Travelers and the first archaeologists rushed to find that very antiquity. But what did they do when they encountered wastelands and wild tribes instead of marble gods? How did they force the stones to match the book descriptions? The academic inquisition. Try challenging a school history textbook today, you'll be laughed out of the room instantly. But as far back as 1770, attempting to tell the truth about Greece made you an official pariah. By the mid-18th century, the Ancient Greece project had become so profitable for European monarchies that any criticism was equated to sacrilege. There was a thin layer of honest researchers who pointed out inconsistencies in chronology and the lack of material evidence confirming a golden age. However, the propaganda machine was running at full capacity. The few historians who questioned the legend were not just ignored. They were erased from the scientific community, stripped of their titles, and denied the opportunity to publish. The mythical concept of Hellenism was elevated to the status of an untouchable cult because the new identity of all Europe was built upon it. A lie repeated 1,000 times became the ultimate truth. By 1821, the European public was so deeply injected with 3 dangerous ideas that stopping the looming geopolitical catastrophe was impossible. What were these ideas that turned ordinary citizens into fanatical supporters of war? The great ideological trap Europeans invented a paradise of demigods and firmly believed that the contemporary rabble on the outskirts of the Ottoman Empire were direct descendants of Achilles and Plato. By the start of the Greek Revolution in 1821, Western society was in a state of collective psychosis built on three false postulates. First, everyone believed that ancient Greece was a real Eden inhabited by superhumans. Second, the public was convinced that the shepherds and mercenaries living in the Balkans in the 19th century were the biological continuation of those very antique heroes. And third, Europe was persuaded that any war against the Turks in this territory was a sacred act of resurrecting former glory. It was a grand ideological trap. People were forced to fight for the resurrection of literary characters who had nothing in common with reality. The most cynical part of this story is that the decision regarding the future of this land was made in Paris and London long before the first shots were fired. How was the fate of an entire region determined by people who had never heard the living speech of those they intended to liberate? Hellenism, a love affair with a dream. Britain and France didn't fall in love with a real country, but with a convenient symbol. They desperately needed a noble past, and they fabricated it without leaving their offices. Renowned British journalist David Holden called this phenomenon Philhellenism, a love affair with a dream. Europe, striving for world domination, required a foundation, a source of its own enlightenment and superiority. And it found it in a mythical ancient Greece, a Greece of its own invention. This was not a historical reconstruction, but a pure ideological necessity. Harvard professor Michael Hertzfeld, who studied this issue for decades, confirms that the creation of Greece in the 19th century was one of the most explosive political adventures. It was a turnkey project created for the needs of the great powers, where real people and their culture were merely an inconvenient obstacle on the path to a grand goal. But how far did the architects of this project go? It turns out they didn't just invent a concept, they initiated a full-scale war to literally hammer this fiction into the soil of the Balkan Peninsula. The great powers orchestrated a struggle for independence to animate the dead. You heard that correctly. An entire country was conjured where it had never existed, all for the sake of resurrecting a literary myth. European politicians didn't just sketch the concept of Hellenism on paper. They transitioned to active measures, utilizing the military might of the great powers. The so-called Greek War of Independence was scripted from start to finish. The goal was ambitious and chilling: to build a state on a foundation made entirely of fiction. By initiating the conflict, Europe essentially crammed into world history a new entity designed to be a living monument to a non-existent antiquity. This was an unprecedented case where political borders were drawn not according to ethnic or historical boundaries, but along the contours of Lord Byron's fantasies. The demographic vacuum. But if the ancient Hellenes are merely a beautiful phantom, who actually inhabited these rocky shores at the moment independence was proclaimed? The answer to this question still makes modern historians nervously avert their eyes. Take the data from any honest census prior to 1828. You will be shocked to find everyone from Macedonians to Gypsies, everyone except the Greeks themselves. If we cast aside schoolbook propaganda and look into the demographic archives uncovered by Macedonian historian Risto Stefov in his investigation, Uncovering the Greek Myth, the truth is deafening. Between 1828 and 1829, the territory of the liberated country was a patchwork of peoples: Albanians, Vlachs, Turks, and Macedonians. But there was one problem: ethnic Greeks did not exist there as a class. The very term Greek was a legal fiction introduced to label the diverse population of the Balkans. Before 1829, these people not only did not call themselves Greeks, they didn't even understand what the word meant. Radical social engineering. How then, in the 20th century, did the country suddenly become purely Greek, with a monolithic national identity? The secret lies in the most massive and cynical operation of deportation and document forgery in modern history. How do you turn 1 million Turkish Christians into descendants of great ancestors in just a few years? The answer is simple: issue them new passports and forbid them from remembering their mother tongue. In the 1920s, the Greece project faced a demographic crisis, and the solution was found in the spirit of radical social engineering. More than 1 million people were forcibly relocated to the country from Asia Minor. These people were Christians, but as contemporary documents testify, they didn't know a word of Greek and never considered themselves Greeks. Nonetheless, official Athens immediately dubbed them the returned descendants of the ancient Hellenes. It was a colossal operation of ethnic falsification. Strangers were used as a human shield to fill empty lands and finally cement the myth of a monolithic nation. From Albanian villages to world centers, the most absurd part of this historical comedy is that even the current capital, Athens, was nothing more than a pathetic Albanian village until the 19th century, with not a hint of Hellenic spirit to be found. How was this settlement transformed into the center of the universe? Diplomats of the past left records that today would be considered dangerous to the system. They recorded the reality on the ground, while armchair scholars drew maps of utopia. If we put Lord Byron's poetry aside and open the reports of professionals, the image of the cradle of civilization crumbles into dust. British diplomat and Baron Rennell Rodd wrote explicitly in 1892 that the medieval wastelands of the Balkans were gradually settled by Latin mercenaries and Christian refugees. There was no continuity, no blood of ancient heroes, only Albanian mercenaries brought to Mistra by Manuel Cantacuzénos in the 14th century and colonists on a deserted peninsula. His colleague, historian Edward Blaquier, confirmed that cities did not emerge as heirs to the polis, but as wretched villages on the barren rocks of the Peloponnese, where impoverished families of Southeast Europe tried to survive through fishing, fresh concrete and ancient marble. But if the modern settlements and cities were built by refugees and mercenaries in the Middle Ages, where did the snow-white ancient temples come from? We come to the most daring part of this global fraud. Many of the antiquity monuments you admire on vacation smell not of eternity, but of fresh 19th century concrete and rebar. To make the myth of a great civilization work, books weren't enough. Physical evidence was required. Thus began the era of revolutionary restorations, where archaeologists with suspicious enthusiasm reconstructed ruins from, well, more ruins. Many sites were literally built from scratch to match European patrons' ideas of correct architecture. Historians point to harrowing facts. Ancient stones were recut to fit modern blueprints, and gaps in history were filled with replicas. We are used to believing our eyes, but the reality is that behind majestic facades often lies a high-quality falsification designed to legitimize an invented statehood. Conclusion: the triumph of marketing stones can be silent, but they can also lie if backed by the political will of an entire continent. What conclusions do we reach when we put all the pieces of this puzzle together? Ancient Greece is not the foundation of the Western world. It is the most massive example of fake news stretched across centuries. We have seen how an ideal image, which every schoolchild believes today, was constructed out of political ambitions, poetic fantasies, and mass migrations. It was a lesson in how easily a past can be created if you have enough ink, money, and cannons. The true history of the region was erased, and in its place was erected a simulacrum convenient for the great powers. The entire Hellas project is a triumph of marketing over facts, one that continues to define our worldview to this day. But Greece is not the only example. What other ancient civilizations were created in the silence of European offices to manage the modern world? Subscribe so you don't miss the next portion of the uncomfortable truth.